Yeah, thank you very much for the kind introduction. And first of all, of course, I would like to thank the organizers of this conference for doing such a great work, for this excellent preparation of this conference. Thank you very much, and for the kind invitation. But I also want to thank the people working in the background, helping us to provide us with the good opportunities here for our good conditions for our exchange of ideas. My talk now will be a little bit provide a strong rupture. Now, I will not talk from a phenomenological point of view, what was overwhelmingly done yesterday in many talks. And I will also talk from another perspective, namely from the subdiscipline of philosophy, the history of philosophy. But I think as long as such a big part of our work, of our research, and also particularly of our teaching is done in front of the background of the history of philosophy, because we are referring all the time to our forefathers and mothers in philosophy, I think our subdiscipline of history of philosophy is of eminent importance, also for the question of place. I want to address these questions here mainly in view of the methodological challenges that arise from doing a history of philosophy in a global perspective, which is a challenge we are confronted today in our subdiscipline of the historiography of philosophy, and I will use Africa as an example here. So to a certain degree, of course, I will also link to all these questions of belonging, which have been raised yesterday already, but it will be discussed in a different setting. Various methods of systematization have been used in the historiography of philosophy. Obviously, time is a fundamental organizing principle. Histories of philosophy are arranged in chronological order according to centuries or epochs. But place is another typical organizing principle. Also, this is very often not explicitly mentioned in the title of the books, or also not explicitly reflected in books with the title History of Philosophy. A large number of histories of philosophy have been and still are published under the simple title History of Philosophy, without mentioning the place or any other specification of the scholars and theories covered there. However, if one takes a closer look at these histories of philosophy, one realizes that they deal exclusively or mainly with theories and philosophers from Europe, or what was or is understood as the European or Western cultural and intellectual space. The most outstanding place for philosophizing for many authors until today. And here is one example which I have been choosing out of many other examples which you also might know. I used an example in English language published at the beginning of the 20th century by Thomas Hunter, where we also see in the title only History of Philosophy, and then it is organized according to epochs: ancient philosophy, medieval philosophy, and modern philosophy. And there's only a very small excursion to Arabian philosophers. Here we have at least the term Arabian in it, but it is, of course, only referred to in the medieval philosophy, as if there were no Arabian philosophers later on in the history of philosophy. So this, I think, is a very typical example of histories of philosophy as we find them in the shelves of our libraries. But place is not trivial and plays a significant role in the historiography of philosophy, as it not only refers to physical locations where philosophers lived and worked, but also to the intellectual and cultural context in which philosophical ideas developed. Understanding the importance of place in the historiography of philosophy provides valuable insights into how philosophical ideas are influenced by their environmental and social surroundings. Moreover, philosophers interacted with one another within specific geographical locations, forming intellectual networks that contributed to the development of their ideas. The exchanges and debates that took place in these places influenced the direction of philosophical thought. And sometimes philosophers traveled. They went to other countries, they went into exile sometimes, they changed places, and all this is a challenge for the historiography of philosophy. The importance of place as an organizing principle of histories of philosophy changed with the beginning of the 20th century. In the 20th century, we find quite a number of histories of philosophy now, which particularly deal with a certain place of philosophy. So, famous example is History of Western Philosophy by Bertrand Russell. We have histories of German philosophy. We have a history of British philosophy, or several histories of British philosophy. We have at the beginning also of the 20th century, of course, the famous history of Indian philosophy by Surendranath Dasgupta, and more recently now also various kinds of histories of African philosophy. In the following, I will discuss now the challenges of place and the localization of philosophy and philosophers for the discipline of history of philosophy, and illustrate these challenges using the example of Africa. And I will proceed in 3 steps. I will first of all discuss the concept Africa. Second, I ask, who is an African philosopher? A question which was widely discussed also in African philosophy in the second half of the 20th century. And third, I will try to draw some conclusions for the further work of my discipline. So, where is Africa? In contrast to Europe, whose continental borders were drawn with a certain arbitrariness by the Eurasian earth mass, Africa is a continent that can be geographically demarcated by its coasts. But the question, what and where is Africa, which at first glance appears to be easy to answer, turns out on a closer inspection to be a very complicated question that goes far beyond the course of geographical defined borders. It refers to the various layers of meaning of the term Africa, to images, associations, metaphors, attributes, and characteristics, to ideas that have been handed down for centuries and have little to do with the geography of the continent. And so any attempt to write a history of African philosophy or a history of philosophies in Africa cannot avoid taking a closer look to at the category, or maybe this theoretical construct, Africa. So, where's Africa? The first thing that catches the eye is that the geographical continental unity of the continent is usually ignored, both in everyday consciousness, as reflected, for example, in mass media representations, and in academic discourses and disciplines. The continent of Africa is commonly divided into 2 regional spaces, north and south of the Sahara, with the Sahara often appearing as a kind of fixed, uncrossable border that seemingly justifies viewing both parts as largely independent of each other in their historical and cultural development. The part north of the Sahara is often regarded as not really belonging to Africa, but as part of the Arab world. The Arab world, in turn, does not form a geographical unit, but is defined by the Arabic language and the influence of Islam. The northern Mediterranean coast of Africa is also often assigned to the Mediterranean culture, which can be defined neither linguistically nor religiously, but only geographically by the direct connection to the sea between Africa and Europe. This region is often not regarded as part of Africa proper, a term used by Hegel in his lectures on the philosophy of history, and I'm very grateful to Professor Lau, who already introduced some critical remarks on Hegel's lectures on the philosophy of history. According to a widespread understanding, Africa proper only begins south of the Sahara. The term Africa proper brings us to the next layer of meaning, namely the colonial equation of Africa with the image of savagery, heat, primitive cultures, blackness, or the heart of darkness, is the title of a book by Joseph Conrad. Or in more recent form of expressions, underdevelopment, mismanagement, hunger, disease, civil wars, and chaos. It turns out that the separation of the geographical parts of Africa was based on the ideologically motivated desire to separate both the highly esteemed cultures of ancient Egypt and later the Arab world from the wild, black and chaotic Africa, south of the Sahara, which was denied culture, science, and rationality. Achille Mbembe, historian and philosopher from Cameroon, discusses some of the images and metaphors evoked by the term Africa in his book Critique of Black Reason, under the telling title of the chapter, The Well of Phantasms. Africa is, Mbembe states, I quote, a living figure of otherness, the symbol of a dark and blind force trapped in a pre-ethical and pre-political time. One of the most famous attempts to separate Egypt and North Africa from the rest of Africa is probably the already mentioned lectures by Hegel on the philosophy of history. Here, Egypt is explicitly described, and I quote, as not belonging to the African spirit. Moreover, Hegel underlines the northern part of Africa, which may be specially called that of the coast territory, lies on the Mediterranean and the Atlantic, a magnificent territory on which Karthago once lay, the site of the modern Morocco, Algiers, Tunis, and Tripoli. This part was to be, must be attached to Europe. And the emphasis is not by me, the emphasis is by Hegel, must be attached to Europe. So while Africa proper was not an arena of world history for Hegel and therefore not a place where philosophy could emerge, as an independent player, Egypt was an important part of world history to which Hegel dedicated the separate chapter in volume 2 under the title The Oriental World. Like Hegel, many people saw, and unfortunately still see, Egypt as an independent cultural region with no connection to Southern Africa. And here I come back to a map which was shown by Professor Lau yesterday already. Thank you also for introducing Elmar Hohenstein and his Atlas of Philosophy already here. I'm also a big fan of the work of Elmar Hohenstein. Here in this map, Hohenstein tried to illustrate, to map really on a geographical map, the history of philosophy as it was described by Hegel. And what we can see here, apart from what Professor Lau mentioned already concerning Asia, we can see here that Northern Africa is still included a bit as a kind of trend, a tradition under the name Mohammedanismus here. So Islamic philosophy is taken into account from Hegel, but it ends abruptly, yeah, namely in the Middle Ages. And Africa south of the Sahara is not even mentioned, is not in the view, doesn't take place, is not a place of philosophy. I think this map is really very much telling. So, but this idea, and by the way, there's an open access resource to the philosophy atlas at the homepage of the ETH Zurich. So this approach, which is completely unhistorical, of course, overlooks intensive political and economic relations with the south of the continent, which went hand in hand with an exchange of knowledge and ideas along the trans-Saharan trade routes. An unhistorical approach, as in Hegel's case, negates the millennia-old connections between all regions of the African continent. Such an approach also ignores the centuries-old historical anchoring of Islam in countries south of the Sahara, namely since the 11th century in West Africa and even earlier on the East African coast. Northern and Southern Africa are not culturally and intellectually distinct areas as suggested by the classification of academic disciplines. On the contrary, a historical analysis reveals the diverse cultural, political, economic, religious, and intellectual links between the two regions. So actually, the term Africa is associated with a geographical restriction, as North Africa is usually separated from the rest of Africa. This reflects, for example, in the organization of disciplines that have Africa as their object of research, which are divided into Islamic studies for North Africa and African studies. This has tangible consequences for the history of philosophy and manifests itself, for example, in the fact that histories of Islamic philosophy only cover North Africa and usually end at the Sahara. Islamic Arabic philosophical traditions south of the Sahara, for example, in Mali or on the East Coast, are not considered. But these traditions are also not included in African histories of philosophy either. So it seems that there is still no place for Arab Islamic philosophies south of the Sahara in the history of philosophy. History of philosophy is still blind, has still blind spots, and is to a certain degree a victim of our system of categorization. The problem can be best described in the following quote by the Nigerian philosopher Olufemi Taiwo. He says, "Once we deploy sobriquets such as sub-Saharan Africa, pre-colonial Africa, traditional Africa, Black Africa, we immediately scramble the discourse to follow, induce certain expectations, limit possibilities for thought and analysis, and just generally condition the outcome in which Africa is not like other areas, a contingent agglomeration of peoples, ideas, movement, traditions, and so on, but rather a necessarily different place like no other, and therefore unlikely to be considered in its liaisons, conversations, debates with the rest of common humanity." I think particularly when he says that it limits our possibilities of thought and analysis, this is such an important point, what he here makes, Olufemi Taiwo. Until today, only a few philosophers in Africa have dared to resist these limitations and to build a bridge across the Sahara in their work. And I think a very good example for crossing the bridge is the book by Shamil Jepi and Suleiman Bashir Dian, The Meanings of Timbuktu, where the authors clearly show the strong intellectual connections between Timbuktu and the area there in Mali with Morocco in the 15th and 17th century. So, but the use of the term Africa is not only associated with geographical reductions, but also goes along with the geographical expansion. This is because the term often also includes the African diaspora, in particular the descendants of enslaved African people in both Americas and the Caribbean. One result of the transatlantic slave trade is therefore that the idea of Africa today extends beyond the geographical borders of the continent. With regard to philosophy, it is above all Afrikaner philosophy that becomes a challenge for the definition of what is to be understood by African philosophy. Afrikaner philosophy is generally understood as the work of philosophers of African origin in the Americas and the Caribbean who deal with the life experiences of the African diaspora. Both the reference to an intellectual and cultural heritage in the form of cosmologies, gods, myths, religions, proverbs, or values and norms, and the shared history of slavery, forced labor, and colonialism, as well as the experience of racism, exclusion, and devaluation, are commonalities that determine the production of knowledge and also philosophy in Africa and its diaspora. Furthermore, intellectual work in the African diaspora has strongly influenced the development of philosophy in Africa in the 20th century. Examples include the influence of the Harlem Renaissance on the négritude, or the influence of Aimé Césaire or Frantz Fanon, both from Martinique, on the discourse of philosophy in Africa, which continues to this day. If we, for example, consider the works of Achille Mbembe, who draws very strongly on Frantz Fanon. Conversely, thinkers such as Leopold Sédar Senghor, Cheikh Anta Diop, or Théophile Obenga have had a strong influence on Afrikaner philosophy. In this respect, the significance of the philosophy of the diaspora in a history of African philosophy must be examined, as there are justified doubts as to whether an exclusive focus on the African continent can do justice to the supra-regional interconnections of thinkers and traditions of thought, as well as the history of the impact of concepts. So to sum my first point up, the attempt to treat Africa as a narrowly defined geographical area within the framework of a historiography of philosophy, and moreover, to restrict even this area to the southern part of the continent only, quickly reaches its limits. And not only with regard to centuries of the centuries of the transatlantic slave trade and colonization. Close links between the African continent, the Mediterranean region, Europe, and the Arabian Peninsula can be traced back to the early centuries. But since colonization in particular, the African continent has been even more intensively integrated into global interdependencies of an economic, political, and cultural nature. The development of traditions of thought and also of philosophy rarely adheres to artificial spatial or national boundaries. Rather, ideas always arise in connection with and through a lively exchange between people from different regions, cultures, and communities, and Africa is here, of course, no exception. Let me turn now to my second point. Who is an African philosopher? Does Anton Wilhelm Amo, a philosopher of the 18th century, who was born in Africa but lived in Germany from an early age on and was trained as a philosophy professor there, belong to a history of African philosophy? A philosopher trained in Latin and Greek who practiced metaphysics in the sense of Christian Wolff? This is one of the questions discussed and not always answered positively in the historiography of African philosophy. On the other hand, Amo, as far as I know, has never been included in a European or German history of philosophy. So is there no place for Amo in the historiography of philosophy? In the European tradition, the geographical affiliation of philosophers is not so frequently discussed, sometimes, but not so frequently. Rather, there's an almost inclusive approach in which Thales, who actually came from Asia Minor, or North African scholars such as Origenes or Augustine, are easily assigned to the history of European philosophy, regardless of their geographical origin or the places where they were living, working, and thinking. One wishes such a relaxed and integrative approach to the people from these regions living today. We see clearly here double standard. The integration of heroes of the intellectual history is easy, but the exclusion of real living people is what we are facing today. In the cases of Thales or Augustine as giants of the history of philosophy, belonging to the European history of ideas is usually simply assumed without even raising the question of whether influences from the region of origin had an impact on their work. Both are generally attributed to a European, which did not even exist at this time, or Mediterranean world of ideas whose influence is assumed to be so great that it is no longer necessary to ask about their influences from their respective intercultural contexts. However, such questions of belonging are important in the context of the history of philosophy in Africa. And so early Christian philosophers, such as Graneß or Augustine, are today reclaimed to be part of an African history of philosophy. Since the colonization of the continent, of course, more questions of this kind emerged. For colonization not only has a political and economic side, but also encompasses the sphere of education and knowledge production. This raises the general question, and not only in the case of Amo, of the relationship between cultural, linguistic, religious origin of a scholar on the one hand, and the intellectual affiliation to another epistemic framework on the other, namely Western languages and education. What impact does such a situation have on intellectual work? And what are the consequences for the historiography of philosophy? For the historian of philosophy, this situation, as well as, of course, the results of globalization today, raises very pragmatic questions, such as, do African, Asian, and Latin American philosophers who have been trained exclusively in European or North American philosophical traditions and who work within the epistemic framework and European languages belong to African, Asian, or Latin American histories of philosophy, or do they belong to European or North American histories of philosophy, or both? Let me give an example. Does the history of African philosophy include all philosophers who have practiced or are practicing philosophy on this continent, regardless of the content of their concepts? So the question is, does a Kant or Heidegger specialist from Nairobi dedicating his or her work to these philosophies alone belong to a history of African philosophy? Another question. Does the history of African philosophy also include those philosophers who are not African in terms of their origin, but who have dedicated their work to philosophy in Africa? This also raises the question of whether representatives of the African diaspora are or can be part of a history of African philosophy, or do they belong to the North American, South American history of philosophy? It must also be decided whether South Africans or Namibians of European descent are part of a history of African philosophy. And of course, this question also concerns all other philosophers of non-African descent, for example, from India or various Arab countries who have been at home in African countries for generations. Paulin Huntonji, the Benin philosopher, answers these questions in his famous African philosophy, Myth and Reality. This sentence really triggered a long-lasting controversy in African philosophy. He says, I call African philosophy a body of texts, more precisely the body of texts written by Africans and qualified as philosophical by the authors themselves. So almost every part of this sentence was put into question. Namely, is philosophy only a body of texts? What is about oral philosophies? Second, what means it to be an African? And third, is it the author himself, herself, who qualifies her or his work as philosophy? Another attempt is this one by the Nigerian philosopher Peter Bodunrin. He says, African philosophy is a philosophy done by African philosophers, whether it be in the area of logic, metaphysics, ethics, or history of philosophy. It is desirable that the works be set in some African context, but it is not necessary that they be so. So, I mean, this is a rather relaxed approach to this question. However, this complex question cannot be answered as simple as proposed by Huntonji and Budundrin, as the subsequent debates have shown. The question of who could be considered African was also the subject of a controversial debate, including the example of Amo, whom Huntonji would not make a part of an African history of philosophy due to his involvement in the German philosophical discourse of his time and his the orientation of his work towards a European audience. Many other African philosophers are including Amo into a history of philosophy, so here a controversy is still going on. I hope I have been able to demonstrate that such questions of categorization or systematization are anything but trivial and not easy to answer, especially as it can be politically charged. And what I didn't mention at all in my talk until now, and I cannot explore here today, is of course the question, where is the place of women in the history of philosophy? Let me turn now to some consequences for the history of philosophy of the future. So now, why Africa as a model to discuss the challenges of place for the history of philosophy? I hope that with the examples and questions I raised, I have already been able to illustrate some of the difficulties that arise in connection with the historiography of philosophy in Africa and beyond, and which, moreover, have a significance for many other regions of the world. But I think that the philosopher Bruce Jones has made the significance of Africa particularly evident, especially from the point of view of place, namely in his very wonderful book, Philosophy in an African Place. Here he summarizes the problem in view of the history of philosophy as follows. He says, the history of African philosophy has been the history of struggle to find a place, or to claim a place, or to assert the entitlement to a place in the face of those who have maintained that it has no place. So what about Africa's place in the history of philosophy in the future? A history of African philosophy can neither negate the continental unity in the sense of geographical and historical connection between all regions of Africa, nor the exchange of ideas and concepts beyond the continent. For example, with the Arabian Peninsula, the Middle East, with Europe, and of course the transatlantic axis. But even if we argue that the continental unity should not be divided into North and South Africa in order to show centuries-old relationships, we must admit that continental frameworks as such also entail pitfalls. A continental frame of investigation harbors the danger of not being able to do justice to the plurality of cultural and philosophical contexts of such a large geographical unit. It can lead to generalizations or even essentializations instead of documenting the diversity of also conflicting theories and concepts. If one continent is juxtaposed with another continent, the history of ideas of both continents is similarly robbed of its inner plurality. Such tendencies can be seen very strongly in the dualism of Africa versus Europe or the West, where continental entities are often linked to content-related characteristics. There's a danger here of unacceptable generalizations or even essentializations. For example, Europe is rational, Africa emotional, Europe stands for writing, Africa stands for orality, Europe stands for technology, Africa stands for nature, Europe is individualistic oriented, and Africa is communal oriented. These are the dualisms which we are facing everywhere at the moment. But Africa and Europe as well, and any other continent, is a vast and diverse continent with a rich tapestry of philosophical traditions that vary across regions and historical contexts. And here I want to quote again Bruce Jones, who says the following: African philosophy has emerged as a result of a series of inter- and intra-cultural conversations, and its place cannot be abstracted from those in favor of finding some sort of placeless, timeless African philosophy. So to ask the question, what is Africa, or where is Africa, is also intended here to point to the problematic side of such a link between geographical and intellectual spaces. Developing a methodology that can effectively reconstruct philosophical traditions from different cultural contexts is a complex task. Scholars must grapple with questions of how to navigate cross-cultural differences and avoid essentializing or oversimplifying diverse traditions. So what role do places or geographical spaces play in and for the historiography of philosophy? So far, place has played a rather problematic role in the historiography of philosophy. Geographical, Europe; cultural, the Anglo-Saxon; or political spaces, certain nations, have either been treated as favored for philosophizing or, on the other side, as inhospitable to philosophy, or at least as not of philosophical interest. For this reason, one of the most important tasks of future global historiography of philosophy is to critically analyze the mechanisms of exclusion in the European historiography of philosophy to date. One of these mechanisms is and was place. Entire regions were considered unsuitable for philosophy, be it due climate factors, be it due insufficient social development, be it due religion, animism, be it due to the lack of writing, be it blatantly due to biological racism. At the same time, special places of philosophizing were singled out, such as the miracle of Greece. At the same time, the critical examination of exclusion mechanisms calls for a more intensive work on the reconstruction of philosophical concepts and traditions in regions that have hardly been researched today. Here the following points I think are important. We have to abandon master narratives a la Hegel, with one origin and then a history of progress, which ends in Berlin also. This also means that an additive approach, that means a simple adding of other regional narratives to the existing histories of philosophy, is not a solution. Rather, approaches and methods need to be reconsidered more fundamentally, for example, from the perspective of a history of entanglement or entangled histories, which highlights how ideas and concepts have been traveled, been taken up and changed across the world. Any serious analysis has to begin from the premise that regions, nations, or continents exist not as hermetically sealed entities, but rather as part of permeable, interwoven relationships. And so I suggest to take into consideration these points, which I call, for lack of a better term, now thick description, a term borrowed from the social sciences, particularly from Clifford Geertz, but which I try to feel a little bit different here from the point of view of history of philosophy. So methodologically, it requires some things. Firstly, very precise analysis of the place. That means taking a place seriously, paying attention to the conditions under which philosophy arises, and studying it thoroughly. In this context, place must not be understood as a static entity with a distinct and fixed identity, but must be understood in its historical dynamics with open borders and its connections to other places. Moreover, it is important not to lose sight of the big picture, what means trans-regional entanglements. So I think it is time to think and examine the entanglements of philosophical traditions globally. This means also to take into consideration traveling concepts, but also something what I call here multi-perspectivity. And I think a very important point is also an intersectional approach to philosophy. So in view of the global interdependencies in the history of philosophy, in the history of ideas, the questions we are facing today go far beyond pragmatic questions of the categorization and so the structuring of volumes in the history of philosophy, which is, of course, my motivation, yeah, the point from where I'm talking now. But they go beyond this. They concern the question of what constitutes a place of thought, to what extent a place determines our thinking and how it relates to other places. And does a change of location allow us to recognize the limits of our previously adopted perspective? If intercultural philosophy, and this is how I understand intercultural philosophy, invites us to make such changes of perspectives, and so to get to know other places and perspectives, the challenges for my discipline, the history of philosophy, will not get smaller in the future. Thank you very much.